Hello everyone and welcome back to Water Moon Cards, and today I'm responding to the tag on having a deck collection. This comes from Sapling Tarot, and a bunch of people have been making responses, and I've really been enjoying this tag and wanted to kind of throw in my own perspective on this. What I like about this tag is it really asks you to get personal, so it's not about right or wrong answers. It's just about, your own perspective on being a collector and what you've learned. And I've found other people's insights very valuable. So I hope this will be interesting to you. And I'll link to Sapling Tarot's video below. I also might make a playlist, or I'll try to find a playlist if anybody's kind of collated this, because I'm not sure everyone has used exactly the same hashtag for it, or even put a hashtag in their video description, and it would be nice to see them all together. What Sapling Tarot, Imogen, I believe is her name, talks about in the introduction to her video is, all the different views on collecting and being a collector, and all the different discussions that have happened over the years. And, this has been going on since before I was even on TarotTube, prior to 2020. And it kind of comes in waves, and, sometimes there's a joy about collecting, and sometimes there's a lot of public shame or shaming about collecting, or guilt, or complicated feelings. I'm here to talk about the joy, and also the pitfalls of what I've learned for myself as I've built up a collection over the last 6 years. So let's get into it. Another reason I wanted to do this tag, and I was really happy that it turned out not to be a deck parade kind of video, so it's not like the deck that made you think about this or that, but because I don't do face videos, I will be showing a few decks just to give you something to look at and show you some examples of what I'm talking about. So the first prompt is, how long have you been collecting decks? And I started in 2020. Aimee the Gray mentioned on her video response that a lot of people weren't talking about COVID in their videos, and I guess just want to make it clear that COVID is the reason that I got into tarot. Not because I was so freaked out about the pandemic, but because I sold my business and I was unemployed and really couldn't look for a job at that point, and needed something to do with my brain and my time. I couldn't do my other hobbies. And so, jumping back into tarot at that point was a good mental exercise. It was something kind of difficult to learn and a good challenge, and something to keep me occupied and, feeling like I was doing something useful with my time, something kind of self-improving. And along with that came collecting. And I didn't intend to start collecting when I first started tarot, but I found Tom Benjamin's channel. I was looking for something other than the Rider-Waite-Smith, and I found Tom Benjamin's channel, and he was talking about the World Spirit Tarot deck. And then I was like, oh, there's all these tarot decks out there, and some of them have, more than just like cisgendered white people on them. That's really cool. So people are like updating this imagery and, making it more modern and more relatable. That's really cool. And so I got a couple decks, and then in this rabbit hole of, historic decks, and I started buying more. So that's kind of, I slid into collecting accidentally, although I can say, looking back, it's not a surprise that I started collecting, because this is kind of how I am with all of my hobbies, is that I tend to go full on in terms of like preparation and like getting the right materials, and I am using air quotes there, that desire to like really kit up, really get prepared, but buy all the right stuff to make sure that the learning goes well or whatever, is kind of a tendency that I have. And, I've noticed that about myself. So I'm not surprised that I started collecting decks. I will say that TarotTube was also a huge influence on me. I first started, with the deck reviews on decks I wasn't sure about. I don't live in a place where there's any kind of metaphysical or witchy shops around. And at the time, none of the, even regular bookstores were carrying tarot decks that I know of. Some of them have since started carrying tarot decks. So there wasn't any place where I could, go look at a deck off the shelf. I had to rely on the internet. But then, of course, you get into deck reviews, and then you start getting influenced, and then you start learning tarot, and then you have something to say about it. And so you start your own YouTube channel. And then that really becomes dangerous, because there's this twofold thing of like wanting to have something to talk about and wanting to keep up with trends. And both of those factors can really influence you. even when I was going down the rabbit hole of like older decks and things, I felt like I had to have a representative example of anything that I wanted to show on my channel. So I got into this very dangerous territory of buying stuff just for the YouTube channel, and that ended up not being healthy for me. So that's kind of a long answer, but yeah, that's how I ended up with my tarot collection. And I've since changed my perspective on that. Like for this YouTube channel, I'm starting over, I recognized, okay, I don't have to actually own that deck to talk about it. I can use screenshots. It's okay. And that has been very liberating. Question 2 is, what kind of collection do you have? Imogen gave some examples. Mine is a little tricky to classify, but I would say it's an intentional cross-section spanning tarot history and modern styles, and there's a split between utilitarian and kind of collector items, though I can and do read with most of my collection. It's an eclectic mix of time periods, styles, aesthetics, and moods, and I like each deck to tick multiple boxes. So when I'm shopping for a tarot deck, it has to do more than one thing for me. And I'll actually show you some examples of that. So the first one I'll show is a modern deck. This is the Tarot of Mystical Moments by Catherine Waldstein. And this deck has a mix of imagery that is kind of Victorian, kind of fairy tale, kind of steampunk circusy, kind of fantastical. There's a Victorian kind of card. There's a like fairy tale one. Kind of Alice in Wonderland-y, which is a category that I had been looking for, but hadn't really found the Alice deck that I like. But it's cards like these where I'm like, oh yeah, that scratches that Alice in Wonderland itch for me. Here's another kind of steampunk, Victorian kind of thing. So this deck, it's multiple genres in one, and therefore I don't have to, try to buy one representative example of each of those. I can just enjoy this collection of images instead, and I get a little bit of all of that, if that makes sense. So, and I like all of my decks to do this as much as possible. So to be there for me in different kinds of ways, for learning and for enjoying reading with them. And the same holds true for a lot of my historic decks. So this is the Vandenborre Tarot, the Flemish Bacchus Tarot, and this version is from Pablo Robledo. Editing Luna here. I just wanted to add that the reason I collect historic decks at all is because I do learn from the imagery and how the cultural associations for the cards worked in their own time period and how we can interpret them for today, and that does influence my readings. So what I was looking for with this was a slightly cleaned up version of this deck on decent cardstock, and I had heard of Pablo Robledo and really liked his work, and so I wanted to get one of his decks. So when I, realized that he did this deck, I waited until he republished this. He does smaller print runs, and so I just had to wait, probably 2 years. But as soon as he announced that he was going to have more of these for sale, I jumped on it, and that was really cool. And this cardstock is absolutely luscious, and I love the colors. And it's an example of this style, this pattern, and it's a Pablo Robledo deck. So it ticks multiple boxes for me in that way. And then one last example of, ticking multiple boxes is this updated version of the Crystal Tarot. Crystal Tarot is one that I saw a while back. It was only available really in a Lo Scarabeo multi-language kind of format with the smaller pictures, and I just didn't like it. And so I thought, well, if they ever re-release it as better production, I'll get it. And so they finally did at the end of 2025, I think in October or so. And the other thing is I wanted a more medieval kind of deck in my collection. And as you can see from this card, this really does that. And it has the Eudes Picard pip pattern on it. So again, that's multiple things that it ticks off. It's sort of Arthurian medieval in style, Renaissance-y in style. It's got this beautiful, beautiful paintings on glass. And it has these lovely pips that are in the Eudes Picard system. It also has a hint Cards like this, the coloration and the presentation remind me of the Thoth, but I don't like the Thoth system. I don't really want to have anything to do with Aleister Crowley. Thank you very much. But cards like that do kind of remind me of Lady Frida Harris's art style as well. This has hints of Art Nouveau in it, and so this also scratches that itch. And I'll talk a little bit more about that box ticking thing when we come to kind of your philosophy as a collector. But we'll move on to prompt number 3 now, which is, are you a completionist? And the answer is, in general, no. In terms of completionist of like, I have to have the whole set of these decks that all go together, or I have to have the oracle that matches this deck. I did go down this road in my second year or so of collecting and spent a lot of time and money compiling, groups of tarot decks like 1970s decks or hand-painted RWS clones or Japanese decks or examples of tarot used as a game. And at some point I just looked at myself and said, what are you doing? What are you trying to get out of this? And I realized I wasn't getting anything out of it, and it was actually kind of stressing me out to try to complete any of these categories. And what I really wanted was a best representative example, rather than all of the things that fit into a specific category, if that makes sense. So, I want a best representative example of a Rouen Brussels historic deck. I want a best representative example of a mermaid deck. Something like that, whatever categories I can come up with. A best representative example of a skeleton deck. So that is really helpful. And then it also helps me moving forward to not overbuy in a particular area. However, I also happen to be completionist around particular decks, and this one is completely accidental. So this is the Fifth Spirit Tarot by Charlie Claire Burgess, and when this was first kind of announced, released, hyped on Kickstarter, I was starting to see it on people's channels. I thought, oh great, another beige minimalist RWS, Snoresville. Like, who cares? And then a couple years went by, and I realized what a sleeper gem of a deck this is. I picked up, this is the independent version of this deck, and then I wanted to get the guidebook, so I ordered that directly from Charlie. And along with the guidebook, they sent me this postcard, which was really great. It's one of the reasons I fell in love with this deck, actually. I have a pit bull myself, and so to find a dog on the strength card instead of a cat was just like chef's kiss for me. So relatable. There's the guidebook. They also included a bookmark. I think this was part of maybe the original Kickstarter, so that was really cool. And as long as I was ordering stuff, I went ahead and got the spread cloth that has a bunch of the symbols and implements on it. It's also like my biggest spread cloth. It's really nice to have a really big one for laying out cards on a larger table. So that's super cool. And then just fairly recently, actually, I was over digging around in my mom's stash for something, and I noticed she had a bunch of these custom tarot bags from Moonlit Fae. And I like these tarot wallets. They're really nice. And apparently, I didn't know this, but Moonlit Fae had done a collaboration with Charlie and gotten their designs on some spoonflower fabric and made custom tarot wallets for this deck. So I don't know if there's like a pin or a patch or a sticker or something else I could have gotten, but having the matching bag, the matching spread cloth, the matching bookmark, and the matching guidebook kind of feels pretty completionist to me. And I'm chuckling at myself because this is not normally something I try to do on purpose, but it just happened to happen with this deck. But I'm pleased. This is one of my favorite decks. All right, question 4 is, how do you store and organize your collection? I mentioned this briefly in my kind of reintroducing myself video series back when I started this channel late last year, but I have a bookcase, and what I realized quite quickly is that bookcases are too deep for tarot decks, at least for me, and I can't see what's going on. So my partner very kindly made me some shallow shelving to stick on top of the bookcase, and that's where I've been storing my decks. I would show you again and actually give you a little tour of that, but things are just in disarray. I have been pulling decks out to do a series of videos, so the place is wrecked, basically. And I just realized that I wanted it's a little bit more storage, and I found some other shelves that are about the same size but have more like individual shelves in them. So I'm going to be able to store more stuff up on top of the bookshelf. So that's on the way. I'm going to do a big reorganization, reclassification. I am a librarian, so this is like my happy place. And I look forward to that. What I like about the open shelving and everything being out is I can see everything that I have, and that really helps me cut down on wanting things and being tempted by things, because I can just walk over there and I see all these decks and be like, look, Luna, you have so many, you know, amazing choices, so many beautiful artists' work here in front of you. What could you possibly want that you don't already have? And that really cuts down on temptation. And it's just nice to not have to dig through, you know, boxes or drawers or that kind of thing looking for stuff. So that's why I like to store them all out like this. I do also have like a purgatory to sell shelf in my closet. And I do like having kind of a purgatory place for decks that I'm not too sure about, because I have made some mistakes, and I'll talk about that later. The next prompt is, what is your favorite thing about your collection? I really like how I've curated my collection over the years, and having this wide access to a variety of decks to suit, you know, any kind of mood or historical time period, or, you know, whatever it is, art style that I can kind of think of. And so as I was talking about, over time, discovering that cross-section idea of best representative example of a specific category rather than trying to collect a whole category of something really has made my collection rich and varied. And I don't feel like choosing between two decks is a hard choice, because each one is kind of its own unique thing. Question 6, what is your least favorite thing about or something to improve in your collection? I do have a few decks that I don't read with, and I'm not sure if that's a problem, but then some days when I'm going through my decks and I'm, you know, maybe like pondering buying something new, but then realizing I'm running out of space, I'm wondering why I have them, why I've kept them. And so that does create a little tension for me. Question 7 is, what is the biggest category of your collection? So for tarot decks, I have about 70, and I'll break that down further in the accompanying blog post, which you'll find linked below this video. And then what is the smallest category of your collection? Right now it's Lenormand. I resisted and resisted trying to learn Lenormand, and late last year I bought 2 Lenormand decks. And then I've also got a Sibylla deck and book, kind of workbook learning kit thing on my birthday wish list. And so if I get that as a gift, then I will have a single Sibylla deck. Question 9 is, do you have a holy grail in your collection? And Imogen classified that as the favorite or best deck, or the one you'd save if there was an emergency. I don't know if this is actually the one that I would save. If there was an emergency, I'd probably grab my Llewellyn copy of the Gaian Tarot. That's definitely my favorite deck to read with. But this is a special deck to me, because it's one that I really had to hunt a long time and to get what I found was an affordable and fair price for. And it's a really cool historic deck in that it is the first US printing of the Pamela Colman Smith. So this is a first edition complete tarot cards, authentic, designed by Pamela Colman Smith and Arthur Edward Waite. I love that her name is listed first, by University Books out of New York. And this is known as the Pink Ankh deck. The original first printing comes in this maroon slipcase, and it actually has tarot cards like glued onto each side. So one side has a Fool card glued on and one has a High Priestess. And it took me a while to find, you know, a good quality copy, first edition, on eBay. My set is not entirely complete. This would have come with 2 advertising cards, and mine only has the one. But my copy is in excellent condition. It's not too dirty, grubby, grimy, anything like that. It's not too worn. The colors are still lovely and bright, and it hasn't had, you know, cigarette smoke and wine and everything else spilled all over it. So I don't know. I don't know that I would necessarily buy this deck again. This is definitely the most I've ever spent on a tarot deck. But I'm glad I have it as a historical artifact, and for the impact that this deck has had on, I don't know, I guess you could say the American psyche if you were really going grand with your statement, but certainly on tarot and esotericism and divination in this country. It's really cool. I feel very lucky to be able to have a copy of this in my possession. And I also hunted down oh, I'm sorry, no, I would have had three. Excuse me, I would have had three advertising cards, and I have two out of the three. Anyway, I also hunted down the book that would have been sold separately. So this book that's mentioned here, that you could get for an additional $5, and it's a hardbound book, and it has the full colored plates. So that I know that that book is a first edition, because the subsequent editions only had them in black and white. So yeah, my first edition university books is probably the closest I would say I have to like a grail kind of a deck. I'm no longer in search of these kinds of things. I'm much more interested in, working decks that give me something different to think about. But again, it's nice to have this as a historic artifact. And in terms of grail decks that maybe other people would be, wanting or desiring, I do have a few. I have some Japanese decks that are from the 70s that are pretty rare and hard to get hold of. And I also have some independent decks that, I bought for the original price, and that have some subsequently, the artist has said they're not going to reprint. So they're sought after. Question 10. Do you ever wish your collection was bigger, smaller, or is it complete? I would say my collection at this point is like perennially 95% complete, meaning that I feel very satisfied with what I have. And again, this kind of cross-sectional approach that I've taken. I don't love the size, but again, I think that's a function of my goals as a collector and user of tarot. So I've come to terms with that. So when I reassessed my collection at the end of 2025, I realized I really was pleased with how it had evolved. And, I was glad to see that when I went into my purgatory box, which I'd kind of forgotten even what was in there, and pulled stuff out, I wasn't like, oh no, I can't believe I put this away or whatever. I sold all of those or gave them away to friends, and except for one, no regrets. So it's nice to feel satisfied at this point. That said, I say that it's 95% complete and kind of always will be, because things fluctuate and tastes change and reading styles change, and you learn things about yourself or your decks or whatever. And so I do feel like it's always going to be changing a little bit here and there, but I still want that to be a very slow and deliberate process. Question 11 is, how often do you declutter your collection? So when I was in heavy collecting mode, which was probably, I'd say, end of 2021 and into 2022, I probably did that every quarter or so. And it was just because I was amassing so many decks, and I was changing my mind all the time about what I was collecting, why I was collecting, and all of that. And so I would, get a bunch in one genre, and then I'd be like, no, I'm just going to keep 3 of these. And then I'd get a bunch in another genre, and then just, no, I'm just going to keep these 2, and some of that. I will say that also at that time, it was very trendy to have a lot of like binge purge kind of videos on YouTube. And, I still see some of that on some channels. And I really feel like that's not very healthy for me mentally. So, doing a haul video where you buy 25 new decks at once and show them all, and then a few months later you go through your collection and you pull out, maybe it's not that same 25, but you pull out a whole bunch of decks and you say, here's all the stuff I'm getting rid of. And then that kind of repeats like every 6 months or every year. You're just bringing in a ton, getting rid of a lot, bringing in a ton, getting rid of a lot. Now I give myself a really long purgatory period, and as I hinted in the previous question, sometimes that's not long enough. Sometimes I go back to my purgatory box and I say, yep, I'm definitely done with that. And then a couple weeks later I go, oh, I just thought of a reason why I wanted that deck in there, So question 12, do you ever get envious of seeing other people's collections? I used to, but not so much now. And that's really an honest answer. I think a lot of that has to do with my Buddhist practice and just, really cutting through envy generally, and recognizing what a kind of silly emotion it is to have, even though it's natural. And I certainly do get jealous of people, but just how much it affects your own well-being to sit there in envy. I have gotten way better at talking myself out of a lack or wanting mentality. And I am much more able to just experience other people's joy and be sympathetically joyful for them. So I can watch somebody, unbox a rare deck that they got a great deal on that maybe I did want in the past, or maybe I still do kind of want. and just appreciate that they got this and it's bringing them a lot of joy. I love that my teacher talks about kind of the trouble that comes along with acquiring things. So, if you have one tarot deck, then you have one tarot deck's worth of trouble. And then if you have two tarot decks, you have two tarot decks worth of trouble. And then if you have a really expensive tarot deck that you had to spend hours hunting down on eBay, you have three tarot decks of trouble, right? And it's kind of cumulative. So now that I have 70 tarot decks, I have 70 tarot decks worth of trouble. And viewing it in that way, then I can kind of let go of my jealousy of other people, especially other people who have much, bigger space, much bigger budgets, much larger collections than I do, because I know that they're also in the background worried that what if I have a flood? What if I have a fire? What if my, cat gets up and knocks all my tarot decks on the floor? That kind of perspective has really helped me with the jealousy thing. Who on YouTube has the best tarot collection videos? I will admit I don't watch a lot of these anymore, but I will say that Julie of Peekaboo Rose has done a series recently that I thought was really thoughtful. I've liked Katie of Moonflower Moments. She's kind of a new to me person. The way she talks about cultivating her collection, and also Robin of Robin's Reflections. So I feel like they're thoughtful and they have, very clear goals about why they're collecting in certain areas or what they're looking for. And, it's interesting to hear their perspectives on that. And the last question, and the one that's probably going to take me the longest to answer, is what's some advice you'd give to a future or new deck collector? I have tons of advice. I always do about everything. So just keep in mind, this is my own opinions. This is what's worked well for me and kind of what I've learned from my own mistakes. I am not here to tell anybody what to do with their time or their money or, their space or whatever. I will kind of categorize my advice. I'd say it falls into like acquisition tips and shopping tips, which I'm going to put on the blog. I'm not going to spend time on that here, but kind of how to find rare and difficult to find things. In this video, I want to spend more time on kind of a collector mindset and some of my lessons that I've learned. The first one I'll say is that you will lose money as a tarot deck collector. I don't think anybody gets into this necessarily to make money, but if it is your choice or your ambition to do that, it's very rare that you're over time and overall you're going to make any money, and you're probably going to lose money, especially if you're collecting for yourself to be able to use decks, because most mass market decks are almost worth nothing once you buy them. Just keep that in mind. It's also very hard. Emma the Gray made this point in her video as well. It's very hard to unload mass market decks. I will say that, my advice to start out would be make some wish lists. And maybe you make a wish list and it's got 20 or 30 items on it. Go ahead and buy 5 or 10 of those, or whatever your budget and space will allow. And then just sit with those and, spend some time, read with them, continue your learning process, which, I think should be never ending. And see what your tastes are and what's working for you in readings, and, what kind of imagery you like, and what your kind of preferred shuffling method is, and then how the card stock relates to that, and all the different ins and outs of like the physical object and what it does for you mentally and emotionally. And make notes, keep track of like, oh, I had a really good reading with this deck, and here's why. Here's why this imagery worked so well. Here's why this symbolism worked so well for me. And you don't have to have a goal, but if you think you want to have a collection, I would say figuring out some kind of parameter for that early on will save you a lot of wasted time, consternation, and money. Along with that, I would say try not to get sucked into, popular cycles or a lot of FOMO. There's always more decks coming out. There's always a better deal. There's always a first edition when you got the second edition. Somebody's going to get a better deal than you on eBay in 6 months. You only paid $150 and they're going to get it for $90. And so just keep that in mind. There's going to be better opportunities all of the time, and you're probably never going to complete anything, really. I think that's probably true for any collection of anything. So have some perspective, I guess, or develop some perspective there. And that's, I think, why it's handy to have a goal, because then you can more easily say, well, I'm not going to collect every tarot deck that was ever made, and I'm not going to collect every tarot deck that was published recently, and you can kind of start to narrow it down and say, this is really what my practice is calling for, or this is really an area that I'm interested in, and I'm going to kind of focus my efforts there for now. And I also really liked Lisa Pepez's advice that I heard several years ago now, and hers on, seeking out out-of-print decks. This is the Blood Moon Tarot, and this is the first edition. And Lisa Pepez made a good point. She said, when you're looking for an out-of-print deck and you're tempted to pay a big price for it, think about what would happen if tomorrow it went mass market. If it was like a secret project in the background and suddenly, tomorrow or a week from now or a year from now, it was announced that it was going to go mass market. What would you do? And that's exactly what happened with this. And her advice really saved me from spending a lot of money on this first edition. I was very interested in this, but it was going for ridiculous prices. And I found a kind person who was willing to trade with me. And so that allowed me to, try this deck out, to look at it, to use it. And I didn't know if it would ever go mass market, so I was really happy to have it at the time. But then when the mass market version came out and was released just this month, that was really cool too. And it turns out the mass market version is, in my opinion, it's a lot better. The art's bigger, it's a lot more shuffleable, it doesn't have the busy borders on it, the font's easier to read, and the cardstock's better. And so it's like, what would you do? What would I have done if I'd paid $100, $200, $300 or more for this deck, and then this came out a year later? I'd be pretty disappointed in this case. Other decks that are kind of collector's items like this one, like, it doesn't matter to me that there's a million versions of this, because it's not the content of this that I went for, that I spent the money on. It's this thing as an object, as an artifact, and that's why I was willing to cough up the dough. But in terms of this deck, it's really about the content. It's about the artwork itself. And so I wouldn't be willing to spend the same amount of money on a first edition of this. So you have to answer those questions for yourself. But I really liked Lisa Pepez in the way that she phrased that, is what would you do if, the deck you've been lusting after and thinking you could never get, and then you see it on eBay for $500, and then 2 weeks later it comes out mass market. What would you do? Would you be still happy? For some people that might be a yes, because it's still a first edition, or it's, still something they really wanted, or $500 isn't that much money for them, but we all have our own opinion there. I did speak earlier about how having a TarotTube channel really can be a trap, both in terms of wanting and acquiring things, and also about, the amount of money you're spending and how you're storing everything, and, what are you actually buying, and do you even really want it? So those are all good questions to think about if you're going to start a TarotTube channel. Is why are you starting a TarotTube channel? Having a channel is a different hobby than collecting decks, and collecting decks is a different hobby than reading tarot. These are 3 different pursuits. So while they're all tarot related, they're not the same thing, and they don't necessarily have the same or even compatible motivations. So you have to think about for yourself how they kind of fit together and support each other, rather than pulling you apart in different directions. In terms of shopping, I did spend hours and hours hunting and on auctions and staying up late to get onto the Japanese auction market. It's not just about how much money you're spending, but it's also your time and your frustration and your anxiety and angst and dissatisfaction and your joy, and your happiness. And so now, again, I really try to cultivate that satisficer, happy, contentment kind of headspace, rather than I'm lacking this, everybody else has this, I want this, I need this. And that's really a mindset thing. It has nothing to do with how many decks you have or what decks you have. It's all in your attitude, because again, you can't collect everything. So somebody's always going to have something else that you don't have or can't get. And how are you going to be satisfied with what you do have? And that satisficer mentality is something that I learned. That's a terminology that I learned from Mixtress Ray, and I really appreciate hers. She talked about what she calls her own shopping addiction. I'm not labeling that for anybody else, but she called it that. It made her miserable. actually to be in that mindset all the time of, I want this, I want that, I've got to get the best thing, I've got to get the new thing, I've got to get the shiny thing, everybody else has this, I should want it too, and on and on and on. And so I encourage you to think again for yourself, how do you feel when you're window shopping? How do you feel when you're making wish lists? How do you feel when you're clicking buy now? How do you feel when you're waiting for the mail to show up with that deck? And then how do you feel when you actually unwrap it and get it in your hands? Is it all happy? Is it anxious? Does it make you miserable? Do you feel disappointed every time you actually get the thing in your hands from the feeling of, finally hunting it down online? That's kind of how I felt. It was more about the hunt than it was about the actual ownership of the object. And that's something that I came to realize. And I would say don't conflate excitement with happiness. I think we make that mistake a lot in our culture, in our American consumers culture, that excitement is good. Excitement doesn't last. Excitement is very fleeting. Excitement is, being at the top of the roller coaster and looking at that drop and your belly flipping and your eyes rolling back into your head. It's a rush for sure, but it doesn't last, especially with purchasing objects. I think for me, it's all about focusing on contentment, long-term happiness, enjoyment, appreciation, gratitude, those kinds of feelings. I would say also don't be too quick to get rid of things. Your tastes will change. Your understanding of tarot will change. Your reading styles will change. Your worldview will change. All of these things will change. I'm not the same person I was in 2020 when I first started collecting. And that's good. I feel like I've grown. And I have reacquired 2 decks that I got rid of and regretted and got back. One of them was the Nightmare Before Christmas Tarot. I did a, kind of quick review of this on my channel. I didn't give myself very much time to work with it. I wrote it off. I said some mean things about it and how, this Insight Editions publication, that the people who, picked the images for the cards didn't know what they were talking about. And, I didn't think they did a very good job. And then I gave it away. And then about 2 days later, I got a comment on my channel and they corrected me on a bunch of my misinformation and they pointed out some things that I had kind of missed. And then I went, oh, damn, I really want that deck back. And so I traded back for it. And I'm really glad that I did. I love this deck now. And I use it a lot in the kind of, run up to Christmas. It's one of my favorite movies and I love the message of it. So you might buy something, you might not like it at first, you might not understand it at first, but just set it aside, give it a little time to marinate, go read a tarot book, go do some readings with something else, go read with that deck, even if you don't really understand it, just go try it out. Give yourself some time and maybe a lot of time, maybe like a couple of years time, before you decide for sure that, you really don't want it. I had a similar but reverse experience with the Antique Anatomy Tarot. So again, it's about the same time that I saw the Fifth Spirit Tarot. I was seeing a lot of the Antique Anatomy, first the original version that's in black and white and was on Kickstarter, and then this mass market version where the artist added a lot of color. And, I was really drawn to this. I love the kind of memento mori and medical scientific approach to this, kind of pharmaceutical, medical imagery. And I thought I wanted it. And then I looked closer and I realized that a lot of the cards, like especially the cup suit, like this one, kind of has RWS leaning cards. So this is the 4 of elixirs, and the jars are like cyanide, heroin, morphine, and arsenic, so poisons and addictive things. And that makes me think about the 4 of Cups and the RWS, and that kind of was like, ugh, that's so unimaginative. Why did you have to like dictate the meaning of this card through your choices of the labels on the bottles? And I was irritated, and so then I was like, no, I don't want it. And I kept kind of flip-flopping for different reasons. I'd see it again and see a particular card, like this devil, I love it. I think, oh yeah, I really do want it. And then like, oh no, I really don't want it, and I could never really make up my mind. And so I didn't buy it. This was getting towards the end of my, really strong collecting days. And I just said, if it comes into my life, fine. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And as you can see, it has. And that's because it was a gift from a friend. And funnily enough, it was a gift from a friend that he had bought me 2 years before he actually gave it to me, because he was waiting for me to come visit. And my husband and I weren't traveling at that point. And so when my husband finally did go down for a visit, this friend gave it to him and said, hey, I've had this deck for a while. I got it at a medical history museum, and I know she likes tarot, and I just thought maybe she'd like it. Could you give it to her for me? And so when my partner came home and surprised me with this, I was so tickled because, I'd really been thinking about this off and on for a couple of years and had never had the gumption to make the decision to purchase it. I wasn't sure about it. But the fact that it was a gift from a friend made it extra special and made me really want to spend some time with it. And I did a whole bunch of readings for others at an event. I let them pick what deck they wanted to use, and this one was the resounding, most popular of the choices. And even since then, actually fairly recently, I was just going through some guidebooks of decks that I'd had for a while, and I pulled out the guide for this, and I got to tell you, Claire Goodchild wrote a really good guidebook for this. It's short, it's pithy, and it's insightful. And so I'm looking forward to reading the rest of her guidebook. So, this deck has surprised me. But again, it's one that I slept on, and that's okay, because I really wasn't sure if I wanted it. And if you don't know if you really want something, I guess there's two ways you can go. You can buy it and try it out and see if you think it's okay. But, this one I had a lot of hesitation around, and I'm glad I just hesitated and waited and let, fate or karma or whatever work. And then this deck came in a different way, and in a better way, in a more positive way. So, sometimes things can surprise you, and they can come to you positively, and that's really cool. Sometimes you think you missed out on something, and then a different version of it comes along that's even better. And I'm not just talking about like a first versus a second edition, but maybe it's a deck with a certain theme, like an Alice in Wonderland deck, for example. And then, 5 years later, a better Alice in Wonderland deck that has more resonance or prettier artwork or something like that comes along. So, just because you miss out on something, or just because you're not really sure about something, don't feel pressured that that's your one and only chance. I do think, just like life, tarot can surprise us, and our collections can surprise us. And then the last one, example of this kind of waiting and seeing approach, or putting in things in purgatory and not being too hasty, for me, is Tarot of the Cat People. This is an interesting example because it kind of breaks one of my rules about deck attributes that I like and don't like. I don't really like decks where all the people are facing you, and there's a lot of them in this deck. And I'm not particularly a cat person. I'm allergic to cats, so I haven't had them as a pet since I was a child. So really, there's no real reason for me to have this except peer pressure. Some friends of mine, have talked about it on their channels over the years. And at one point I got really curious, and so I hunted down this vintage copy, as well as the bigger guidebook that was originally published for this deck. And we read the guidebook together. And the guidebook is like this world building kind of fantasy adventure thing. And it was really interesting to read the guidebook, and I'm glad we did. And then at the end of reading the guidebook, I still didn't like reading with the deck. I find it kind of cold. I find it a little bit difficult to read. But you know what? I'm going to keep this. I went to the trouble to find a copy along with the guidebook, and I love the artwork. I think it's really interesting and different. And I love the costumes of the people. I don't know what to do, and when I don't know what to do, I'm kind of like, hold it, just hold your decision making. With the Antique Anatomy, I didn't know what to do, and I didn't have the deck, so I didn't buy it. And then with this one, I have it, and I don't know what to do, so I'm not going to let it go. Just hold fast and wait and see, and we'll see. It will resolve itself one way or another, and it's okay to not know how it's going to turn out. Something else I'll say is that, you'll go through cycles, and also publishers will go through cycles. So sometimes independent artists will say, oh, this is my last printing, or, something will go out of print from a big publisher, and you'll think, oh no, I missed my chance to get that. And then it'll come back in print in a couple of years. So Don't feel like you have to get everything. Some of my items were on my wish list for 2 or 3 years before I was able to get a copy. That's okay. Just, being patient really does pay off. It's also really helpful, I think, to take breaks from watching reviews and deck parades on YouTube, and getting Kickstarter alerts and doing all this stuff. If you enjoy reading, if tarot reading is an adjacent hobby to your tarot collecting, spend time reading, spend time doing deep studies, spend time taking classes, spend time working through a whole 300-page tarot workbook, or a set of journal prompts for every single card in the deck or something. Just find something else related to tarot other than collecting to do, and that will deepen your appreciation. It will deepen your understanding of the cards. It will deepen your understanding of yourself, and then you might find that you don't want as many decks, or you don't want the decks you thought you did, and that'll all shift and change over time. And then think about your motivations for buying from a lot of angles and learn what's important to you, and also learn from your mistakes. When you buy a deck and you don't bond with it, try to figure out why. Is it the artwork? Is it the symbolism? Is it the way the people are represented or not? I've got a whole host of likes and dislikes around things. Next to artwork, cardstock and shuffleability are very, very important to me, and I've learned that the hard way. I've bought a lot of decks that I found unshuffleable and I've had to get rid of. If I don't like even a single card in a deck, and I do mean like a strong reaction, I won't use the deck, because I'll just be too worried that that single card is going to come up in a reading and it'll kind of mess everything up. So I won't buy decks that have a single card. A good example for this would be the Slow Tarot, the Devil card in that deck, or the Japaridza Tarot. The Emperor is labeled War and depicts a battle. I can't do it. Like I said with the Tarot of the Cat people, I don't like it. Typically, I don't like decks where all the people are staring straight at me. I want them to be looking at each other when I lay out multiple cards in the reading, or have different body postures or things like that. So when I watch a walkthrough and I notice a card I don't like, or people staring straight at me, or it's an animal deck and I don't read with animal decks, that actually makes me really happy, because then I don't feel like I'm going to be tempted to buy something else. And I can really then enjoy other people's joy again around things that don't appeal to me. I can be happy that they're happy. I can be happy that there's a deck for everyone, a deck for anyone. And something else that I learned about myself, and I learned this the hard way. I bought 5 or 6 myths and legends and stories kinds of decks before I realized that unless I know the theme inside, outside, upside down, and backwards, and yes, I can sing every single song from Nightmare Before Christmas. I know this movie really well. I know the soundtrack extremely well. So for me, I didn't have to learn about Jack Skellington and his whole world in order to understand what this deck is doing. It just worked for me once I got over my little prejudices about it. But, another show or movie that I wasn't as familiar with, I wouldn't buy the deck. I'm a casual fan of Star Trek. I'm not a Trekkie. I don't know all the characters from all the series and all the plots and all the stuff. I'm not going to buy a Star Trek deck because I'm just not immersed in that world enough to be able to appreciate how it works as a tarot deck. I love Joanna Paul Colbert's imagery on the Gaian Tarot, and I really like the way she's drawn all the images for the Herb Crafters Tarot. But I don't read with plant decks. I'm not an herbalist person. I would have to go through and probably learn what 2/3 of the plants in the Herb Crafters are and what their qualities are. And I know that I just won't do it. I don't use tarot as a learning tool in that way. So I'm not going to buy the Herb Crafters or any other herb or flower-based deck. And so knowing this about myself really cuts down on temptation. It cuts down on the size of my collection. It, cuts down on the amount of hand-wringing and wondering that I do when I see things. I can just kind of say, nope, that's not for me. It's for somebody else. And that's great. And I'll even talk about a couple of decks that are on my maybe list, but I'm not really sure. And these are new releases coming out. So one is the re-release of the Jane Austen Tarot by Los Scarabeo. It's been out in Europe, and I watched a flip through of it just yesterday. I've been aware that Los Scarabeo had done a full 78 card deck for Jane Austen, had written it off as, okay, it's out of print, it's not something I need. And then over the last few years, I have seen that there are various literary tarots that have been released. There's, the American, I don't know, there was a literary tarot that was a Kickstarter. One that Tarot with Mims was talking about that's like classic American literature. There's an Edgar Allan Poe tarot deck. There's all these literary texts. There's poetry decks. And I was thinking, oh, that'd be cool to like find my literary deck. Jane Austen might be it because I'm familiar with all of her writing and I've read all of it multiple times. I've watched a lot of adaptations. I know her characters and her worlds really well. But I'm not sure if I'm going to get the Jane Austen tarot deck yet. I don't know how I feel about the fact that the four suits are not pegged to individual novels, but they all mix different novels together. I don't know if I love the art style. It's kind of this cheesy, romantic, Victorian, storybook illustration style. It fits the Jane Austen theme, but it might be a little too saccharine for me. But there's other things I like about the deck. It's kind of color-coded. It's clear to me who the figures are. And I like the way that Los Carabea has reformatted it as a borderless deck with just, smaller titles on it. So it's like pros and cons, and it's mass market, so it's not that much money, but it is money, and it is space in my house. And am I going to get it? I don't know. I have to think about it some more. It's nice to get to this point where I really understand myself and this balance between being open to new things and wanting to try new things and still wanting to explore what's out there, but also not feeling like compelled or craving in wanting to collect a whole bunch of stuff or feeling, any kind of sense of urgency about, oh, I have to get this, or like if I miss out, it's going to be a disaster. It's nice to just sit back and go, that's interesting. I wonder if I would like it. Let me think about it. Let me think about the rest of my collection. So that was probably my longest ramble to date, but I do really like thinking about this stuff, and I like hearing other people's opinions. So if you have a tarot channel and you've made a response, feel free to leave a comment below with your link. And if you want to just respond on your own in the comments, I'd love to hear your opinions, if you don't have a TarotTube channel. Thank you again to Imogen from Sapling Tarot, and for everybody who's responded. I'm hoping to watch some more of these responses over the next couple of weeks and enjoy your thoughts. And I love that we all have different approaches to this and different ways of thinking about it, and different goals and different tastes. And I think that's something to really celebrate and enjoy. Nobody needs to be right or wrong about any of this. It's just our own experience and what brings us joy and satisfaction. And that's really what tarot is about to me. It's about helping yourself, and it's about helping the people that you read for. And if having a variety of decks helps you do that and makes it fun and interesting, then that's awesome. And I think it's something we can all celebrate, whether we have, one or two decks or 100 or even more. As long as those things are bringing us joy and helping us be better readers, then I think that's super cool. That's all I'll say about that. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.